Good evening, everyone. Fáilteamh go léir anocht, Higlaran agus Cartlin Cahar Bailio Cllr le Hai, Legt John T. Gilbert. My name is Lorraine McLoughlin, City Archivist at Dublin City Council. On behalf of the City Council, the City Librarian Mairead Owens, Deputy City Librarian Brendan Teeling, and all of us here at DCLA, we're delighted to welcome you here tonight. We're especially grateful to be joined by Councillor Paddy McCarthy, who is representing the Lord Mayor of Dublin tonight. Welcome, Councillor. We have a wonderful evening planned, so I'll go right ahead and get all of the housekeeping and announcements out of the way so we can get started. Should the fire alarm sound, we will all need to evacuate the building. There's no drill planned. So if that does happen, there's a fire exit here on my right. We go outside into the lane to the left and then wait at the post office on Ern Street Upper. There are cameras here tonight, as you've seen, so filming and photography will be happening throughout the evening. And we're also live streaming the event online, so a warm welcome to all of you who are joining us from elsewhere. In a moment, I'll welcome Councillor McCarthy to the podium to say a few words, then invite City Librarian to welcome and introduce our speaker. The lecture will be about 45 minutes, after which we can enjoy refreshments and each other's company next door in the Dublin room. So please join me in welcoming Councillor McCarthy to the stage.
Many thanks, Lorraine. Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. It's a great honour for me to be here for this commemorative lecture. It is the 2024 annual Sir John T. Gilbert Commemorative Lecture. I think many of you have been at these lectures before, and some of you probably have been to them all. I think I was at one some years ago, but I can't actually specifically remember, which shows, I don't know what that says about me, but anyway, I want to welcome those of you joining us on the Dublin City Library's YouTube page who are watching from home. I think that's a great innovation for people to be able to attend lectures without having to be physically present, and I'm very impressed with the numbers who are here this evening. It's wonderful to see such continued interest in the lecture series over the years. I did some research myself into John T. Gilbert, and I was amazed at the contribution he has made in enhancing the record of our city. Tonight I'm here to welcome you and to officially launch last year's talk, which has been published in a book. Last May, Dr Máire Kennedy delivered a wonderful lecture entitled Documenting Dublin's History, John T. Gilbert as a Book Collector. Dr. Kennedy became very familiar with the collection during her time as divisional librarian with Dublin City Libraries. The book sheds light on how Gilbert amassed 4,500 volumes in his library and how it has become one of the finest Irish historical libraries of the 18th and the 19th centuries, and is now available here for anyone to use and to research. And I would urge everyone here to encourage people to do exactly that. There's a free copy of Dr. Kennedy's lecture for you all here this evening, and it is also available to borrow from Dublin City Libraries in hard copy or as an e-book from the library's Borrow Box app. That's a new one on me, a Borrow Box app. But I'm delighted this evening then to officially launch Dr. Kennedy's book.
Thank you, Councillor. And congratulations, Moira, on what is a really beautiful publication.
Probably this time.
Thank you. Now we'll have a few words from our City Librarian, Mairead Owens.
Thank you very much, Lorraine, and thank you to Councillor McCarthy for doing the honours tonight, and obviously a warm welcome to Dr Máire Kennedy, a colleague. So good evening, everybody. Ihawa Díobh Cllr, Bawahlam Fulsha Currod, Cllr and Hroyd on Irsig. On behalf of Dublin City Council, I'm delighted to welcome you all here as we continue to celebrate the legacy of scholar, librarian, archivist and collector Sir John T. Gilbert with the 27th Annual Commemorative Lecture. The theme of tonight's lecture is the lived experiences of women in early modern Dublin. Women in history have, as we know, often been omitted from historic sources, a fact which makes the exploration of these hidden histories all the more fascinating to discover. For any group of people, representation in historical sources cultivates a sense of belonging, of agency, of context in place and time, and of understanding. Drawing on a remarkable body of digital data, tonight's lecture will focus on the lives of women in Dublin in the 17th century, a tumultuous time in the city's development. Our speaker, who I'll introduce in just a moment, will set the scene by asking two questions. Firstly, what role did Dublin women play in a society undergoing profound economic, political, and cultural transformation? Second, what were the experiences of Dublin women of recurring social upheaval, bloody civil war, and extreme trauma? To shed light on these questions, I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, Professor Jane Ohlmeyer. Jane is the Erasmus Smith Professor of Modern History at Trinity College, Dublin. She was a driving force behind the 1641 Depositions Project and the development of the Trinity Long Room Hub Arts and Humanities Research Institute. In 2023, she received an Advanced European Research Council grant for Voices, a project on the lived experiences of women in early modern Ireland. She is the author and editor of numerous articles and 11 books, and in 2023 she was awarded the Royal Irish Academy Gold Medal in the Humanities. Her latest publication, Making Ireland, Ireland, Imperialism and the Early Modern World, is based on the 2021 Ford Lectures in Oxford and is one of 6 publications currently shortlisted for the 2024 Michel Dayon Prize for Non-Fiction. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Jane Ohlmeyer to the podium.
Librarian, councillor, colleagues, friends, it's an absolute pleasure and privilege to be here this evening. So thanks to everybody who's in the room, but of course everybody who's joining us online as well. It really is a privilege to be invited to deliver the Gilbert Commemorative Lecture because, as we've already heard, Gilbert and his amazing wife really were the dream team, and this lecture draws heavily on their remarkable calendar of ancient records of Dublin. But it also draws very heavily on the scholarship of those who are real experts on the history of Dublin. And I mean here the PhD thesis by Brendan Fitzpatrick, Patricia Stapleton, the published work of Louis Cullen, David Dixon, Colm Lennon, and above all, Raymond Gillespie. Raymond's sudden and unexpected passing on the 7th of February 2024 has left so many of us feeling utterly bereft. I first met this remarkable scholar when, back in the day, I asked for help with my undergraduate dissertation. That was the beginning of a lifelong friendship with someone who nurtured and inspired generations of historians. And I really am so pleased that his lifelong partner, Bernie Cunningham, is with us this evening. And I'd like to dedicate this lecture to the memory of Raymond Gillespie. So much of this lecture actually derives from the project we've already, the librarian kindly introduced. It's an advanced ERC called Voices, where we want over the course of the next 5 years, we're 6 months into it, 4.5 years, to recover the lived experiences of non-elite women in early modern Ireland. We argue that these women are not absent from early modern history. Instead, they've been hiding in plain sight. And as I say, over the course of the next 4.5 years, we're going to develop numerous case studies, including one for the city of Dublin. So you're getting a very early version of it tonight. It's very much work in progress. So be kind in the questions. My focus this evening is Dublin City. Now that doesn't mean I'm not interested in the county. I'm hugely interested in the county because of course there's tremendous mobility between city and county. But that's another story for another occasion. Now, before I get into the talk, I do want to introduce the Voices team, because projects like these are all about the team, all about the collaboration, and I'm really fortunate that they're all here tonight. I'm not going to embarrass them by asking them to stand up, but this project really was a work of collaboration with the Professor of Computer Science at Trinity, a wonderful man called Declan O'Sullivan. So any hard questions regarding the technology, Declan is the man. And together with Declan, we have already begun to amass just a phenomenal group of scholars. Lucy McKenna is our knowledge engineer. Brona McShane and Daniel Patterson are our history postdocs. And then we have Anne English, who's our project manager, who basically keeps us right. Everybody needs an Anne English. We're also actively recruiting, actually, at the moment. We're going to be looking for somebody who is really an economic historian who can crunch. There's a lot of quantitative data as well as qualitative data we're looking at, and we're also looking at for a literary scholar. So the team will continue to grow along with additional people who can help with the sort of more the technological side. So very much, as I say, a work in progress. The other people we're collaborating very closely with are Peter Crooks and his team with the Virtual Record Treasury of Ireland. I'm sure you're all familiar with that amazing project that aims to reconstitute the archive that was blown up in 1922. I think the novelty of Voices derives in large part from the way that we are interrogating this incredible digital windfall of early modern historical data, much, but not all, of which is in digital format, but has really been very inaccessible and has not been widely interrogated before now. I'm just going to simply introduce you to a couple of the sources. Obviously, we've got a lot of records that relate to land and land holding, maps, surveys particularly. We have really incredible chancery records that Daniel is working on in collaboration with the National Archives. And then we have a lot of wills and testamentary material that Brona is working with, particularly, of course, with the National Library of Ireland. We're very interested in records of debt and credit, and particularly the material held here, the records of the Dublin Statute staple. And I don't know if Mary Clark's here tonight, but many moons ago, Mary Clark really facilitated myself and another colleague, Eamon O'Kearda, in the publication of those statute staple records. We did start, though, with the 1641 depositions, just simply because they've been online since 2010, it is now. They're very well used and curated. They're not unproblematic. In fact, they're probably the most controversial historical records in Irish history, and that's saying something. However, they are of huge value as well. We're focusing on, at the moment, on the 959 female deponents, represents about 12% of the total depositions. But there are thousands of mentions of women, which we are really grappling with at the moment. The vast majority of the women we're looking at the moment are Protestant. But we know a lot about marital status, social status, age, where they came from, and virtually every county, every townland in Ireland, a lot about their material culture, but also their lived experiences of war and peace. So even though they're one-sided, even though they're controversial, I would argue that they are a very important source for us, and you'll hear more about them over the course of the lecture. There are 76 for Dublin County and 46 for Dublin City. It'll be the Dublin City ones I'll focus on. Now, we are using something called a knowledge graph to put all of these archives and records in conversation with each other. And again, any technical questions Declan will explain, but just at a very high level. A knowledge graph allows us, as I say, to put the archives in conversation, and you've got the nodes or the bubbles that represent entities, and the edges relations between those entities. This is what it looks like when we start to use some of our own data, and I'm just simply using the example of Hester Lambert, because Hester, we're already finding, appears in records in the Court of Chancery. She's a creditor on the Dublin Statute staple, and her son Charles is a deponent in the 1641 depositions, and her husband appears in the DIB, the Dictionary of Irish Biography. So the knowledge graph really allows us to bring information about women. So you think Hester Lambert, she's not particularly, she's an elite woman, although there are layers of eliteness, but she's very, very little is actually known about her. We're also able to do great fun things with visualization. And this is a map where we have mapped all of the depositions, and I hope it's going to work for us. I want to play it because it should show you. Oh, we should have tested this. And of course we didn't. So have we got somebody who's a little bit technically more literate than I? It worked on my laptop, but it just doesn't seem to be. Well, maybe it will. Let's see if I squeeze this button here. What happens? No. It's not going to work. Anyway, it doesn't matter. What it would allow us to do, and you'll just have to take my word for it, is to drill down into each of those depositions. So you can see an awful lot of them are down in County Cork, but the ones I'm interested in here, excuse me, are the ones in County Dublin. And if it had worked, which it didn't, you can actually use the map to drill down to the individual depositions. And the one we would have finished with is this one, which is the deposition or examination, actually it is, of a woman called Elizabeth Lake. And Elizabeth Lake lived in Fleet Street. And in her deposition, she recounts a supper party that she attended in the July before the outbreak of the rebellion. The big rebellion breaks out in 1641. The previous July, she's at a supper party that's hosted by a local apothecary, and he's her neighbour in Fleet Street. And one of the other diners is a doctor called Dr Máire. And what is recorded in the deposition is the conversation between Elizabeth and Dr Máire. So he asks her why she would not live in England. Elizabeth replies, and we can almost hear her voice, albeit mediated through a male scribe, that the reason was because her dwelling and means were in Ireland. In response, Dr Máire warned, quote, that he thought it were better for her to live among her friends in England, where she was well beloved, than to live in Ireland, where it is likely there would be cutting of throats. Now, cutting of throats takes us straight in to what I want to do this evening. And the librarian has already shared the two questions that I want to interrogate and hopefully find some answers to. But before I do that, I want to ask a really basic question. How many women actually lived in Dublin in 1641 when the rebellion broke out? Does anybody want to hazard a guess? And not Tara, because she's seen the slides. 5,000? 5,000? I was thinking 5,000. So we're 5,000. So that's in 1641. It all will become clear in a moment. What about fast forward towards the end of the century? say, 1680s, how many women lived in Dublin? 6,000. Any takers? Oh, well, I'm not going to tell you, so we'll wait and see. But actually, it sounds like the most basic of questions, and it's not actually that easy to answer because of the absence of demographic data. And I'll come back to that in a moment. So this is Speed's 1610 map of Dublin, and you can see here the women that I was hoping to introduce you to in the animated map, which didn't work. But here's Elizabeth Moore, and she's an innkeeper in Cook Street. Isabel Guy, her husband was the surveyor of all Ireland. Then we have Jane Bingham, who lives, I think that's in Copper Alley, and she was a tavern owner. And then we've got Elizabeth Lake in Fleet Street, and we're, just so you're oriented, there's Elizabeth Lake. We're up here somewhere. We're in a suburb that didn't even exist in the 17th century. But it's really to figure out how many women lived in that walled city of Dublin. And there's the answer. So the 5,000 figure was actually remarkably accurate. I don't know if it was guessed, maybe you knew, but well done. It's something to watch because we're going to now look at it over time. There was a census, it's not really a census, but that's what it's called, called Done for Dublin, done for all of Ireland actually in 1659. Now, it doesn't list people by gender, but it does list people by ethnicity. So it records the number of people who were described as English and described as Irish. And here you have the 10 parishes that made up the city. And you can see at a glance that the number of English, who are in blue here, greatly exceeds the number of Irish that are in red, and we equate basically English with Protestant, Irish with Catholic, or I think that's what is happening with this census. The reverse is true for the parishes outside Dublin and of course for the county itself. But it's not telling us anything about gender. So the next thing we have are the hearth tax rolls. I've just picked one here, though there are many, and obviously we're hoping to suck many of these into our project. This is the one for 1663, and what that measures is basically the taxes people paid per hearth in their household. And all of a sudden, you can start to see the numbers of women. They're there in red. There's something like 2,400 households. Each household, very roughly 6-7 people. And 9% of these are where the woman is listed as the head of household. The majority of those women are, of course, widows. So let's drill down a little bit into that hearth tax data and see what it tells us. So what you have here are the number of hearths, and the blue is all women, the red are again the widows. So you can see again the widows are predominating, but we have women obviously owning much more modest properties of 1 or 2 hearths, but at the upper end they're running households of 5, 6, 7, 8, and then there are a few with hearths of 9 or 10. They tend to be boarding houses, and we can come back and talk about the boarding houses in a moment. So let's go back to our estimated population of Dublin. So we have these figures. Sadly, we don't have the breakdown for 1659 or 1671, but we do have the figures for 1696. And there you see the total population of the city is over 40,000, and women represent 54% of that population. So sadly, somebody said 6,000. Wrong. Yeah. Good on the first one, not so good here. But what's interesting to me is the proportionality. Women are, again, 54% of the population of the city. Interestingly, here we see that children comprise nearly 1/3 of the population. And I think when we think about women, we need to think about girls as well as women, never mind the boys who are very neglected as well. So as we start, I'm going to share with you now some data into births and deaths. But I just want to be clear, the data about marriage, and this is lovely Bruegel's celebrating of the peasant wedding, the data on marriage is very, very dirty, very noisy. And I've excluded it here in what I'm about to show you, just because I don't think it actually tells us anything meaningful. However, I'm hugely interested in marriage and hugely interested in how Catholics and Protestants intermarriage and how that impacts on assimilation. But we have to look at other sources for that. And as I say, this evening I won't touch on it, but I'm very interested in it. It's the hatch, the match, the dispatch. And obviously looking at these 10 parishes, many of you will be aware, compared to England, how few parish registers and church wardens accounts that we have for Ireland, never mind for Dublin. But we do have actually remarkably good records for one parish, the parish of St. John. And I should say Raymond was hugely important in making this material accessible. The parish of St. John really is the heart of the medieval city of Dublin, close to Christ Church. It included parts of Fishamble Street, or it's all of Fishamble Street, Copper Alley, Smock Alley, Wine Tavern Street, Cook Street, along with Wood Quay and part of Merchants Quay. It appears to have been very densely populated in the 17th century, and we know from the 1659 census that around 900 people were recorded as living there. 87% of them were English, Protestant. By 1696, the population had nearly trebled. So you see, it very, very intensely inhabited. Of the female population, and remember that figure, 54% of the overall population is female, of that, 30% were girls in this particular parish. And then of the adult females, 36% of them were servants. And I've more to say about servants in a moment, but there are more servants living in the parish of St. John than any other of the Dublin parishes. We also have the vestry book for St. John's, again edited by Raymond, where records of cess payments are recorded. They're just so rich, these sources, in having a micro study of the parish. So when we look at the data for births and deaths, we plot it. What you see there are, I'm just looking at the female births and deaths. So the baptisms there are in the red line and the burials are the blue. There's two big spikes. I'm going to come back and talk about those spikes in a moment. But what I want to do here is just add in the male births and deaths. The first thing I would note is that there's incomplete data for a couple of years, and that's where you see the gaps. We just don't have any information at all. From this, you can see very clearly that more men were buried than women, and we see that wherever we have this sort of data. We also know from the vestry records that of the deaths, between a third and a half were deaths of children. As I say, I'll return to those spikes in a moment. As the century progressed, so did interest in how people died. And we have a really quite remarkable bill of mortality for 1683 to 1684. And it shows that 150 people died of old age. And I mention old age because it's women. The people who reach old age tend to be female rather than male. We also see high levels of mortality with infants. It provides a fascinating insights into the prevalent diseases people suffered from and their death would have been caused by many of these diseases. Measles, very much on our radar recently, claimed in a single year 122 lives. Consumption 322, fever 527. Sorry, this is not just one parish, this is the entire city. Less common were spotted fever, canker, worms, rickets, French pox, which is syphilis. But we also have more gendered deaths in childbed. And the 4 women who committed suicide. One choked herself, one hanged herself, one drowned herself, one poisoned herself. Another was, quote, hurt and ill-used by her master and mistress. So in other words, she's probably beaten to death. The image that you see is a fascinating one. It's the waking of Lady Arran in, they had a very posh house just opposite Trinity, the Butlers of Ormond, and she died of smallpox. And you can see very clearly then the women who are keening at her death, but you can also see here a black slave that lived in Kilkenny Castle. I think his name was Scipio. But again, there's so much fascinating material. I don't have time to dwell on this. What I want to just say one more thing about before I go back to those 2 questions that underpin this lecture is comment on the religious composition of the city. Because this is something we know a little bit about. And here we have the religious breakdown of the city in 1644. Remember, 1644 is 3 years after the rebellion breaks out, and you can see at a glance that nearly 1/3 of the population was Catholic. And I think it's worth noting that in the pre-war years, Catholics would have served as church wardens and would have been buried alongside Protestants, including in January 1648, a Catholic priest called Matthew Roche. So again, really fascinating stuff in those church warden accounts. Now, Dublin had always been a colonial city, but from the 1640s, the Protestant interest really predominates. That said, in 1657, now remember this is the height of Cromwellian Ireland, there were complaints that Irish rather than English was, and I'm quoting here, commonly and usually spoken, and the Irish habit worn not only in the streets and by such as live in the country and come to this city on market days, but also by and in several families in this city. To make matters worse, people swore, cursed, and blasphemed in both languages. And they were much more concerned about that than anything else. All right, then. So let's now move on to those 2 big questions. As we answer the first one, what role did Dublin women play in a society undergoing profound change? I think here the depositions can be very valuable. And this is where we turn to the female deponents for the city, 46 of them. Half of them were married, 16 were widowed, and 5 were unmarried. And they're very unflatteringly described as spinsters. I mean, it's a legal term, but anyway. 12 of these women were really refugees who come to the city during the 1640s and then make the city their home. And I'll come back to those refugees in a moment. Each deponent signed her name or left a mark if she couldn't sign. Since reading was generally taught, and of course Maura knows this better than anyone, as a skill before writing, analysis of the depositions might shed light on levels of literacy in Ireland, at least amongst the Protestant women. Now this is a very small sample. But even so, the proportion who signed was very high compared to other regions in Ireland or indeed England, where research on signatures suggested that on the eve of the outbreak of war, 1/10 of all women could sign their names. It's a much higher proportion here. And of course, literacy levels were highest in urban areas and amongst the social elite. And those women, our Dublin depositions, those women who could sign their names tended to be married to aldermen, to clerks and the clergy, while those who couldn't, who left a mark, usually an X, were married to men who worked as merchants, tradesmen and craftsmen. Now, some of these women were free women or citizens of the city. And this graph shows their admissions during the early decades of the 17th century, when 307 women became citizens, and they do so either as daughters of freemen, and that's what you have in the light blue. So the dark blue here are the men, the light blue are the women who become admitted as daughters of freemen. There were a few others that were admitted by special grace, which was normally reserved for men, so I'm sort of very interested in those. But the majority of these 307 women were of their Old English surnames and were predominantly Catholic. But what's so interesting is the fact that women comprise 12% of admissions to the franchise, which really is a very high number indeed, given that we're talking about the early 17th century, because the equivalent figure for, say, 16th century York would be 1%. So you have to ask yourself, what's going on here? And this figure rises in the 1630s to 14%. Brendan Fitzpatrick suggests that it's to do with brewing, and I'll come back to brewing in a moment. But I actually think there's something else going on here, and that they're also using women as part of a political struggle for power in the city. So the Catholics need the numbers, and so they're enfranchising women. But I'm just really beginning to work on this. And the reason that I argue or suggest that is when we come to the 1650s, we see the numbers of women drop significantly. And it's really only again after 1685 and the advent of James II, the Catholic English king, that we see the numbers go up. And in fact, in a single sitting in 1688, 83 women were admitted in a single sitting. They're predominantly Catholic and Old English, but they were the daughters, the granddaughters, the stepdaughters, any sort of female relation possible of the mayor, the recorder, the burgesses, the aldermen, and the sheriffs. And then 2 years later, they're all stripped of their freedom of the city because, of course, James is deposed. Just want to say one final thing very quickly. You see the red bits at the top. These are 54 men who were admitted in the right of marrying a free woman. So it obviously is a privilege, and a citizenship was highly prized, and it was jealously guarded. And any woman who married a papist forfeited her freedom of the city, unless she paid a fine of £20. And again, I'd love to see that fine book. I'm sure it exists somewhere in the archive, because it'll tell us something immediately. Let's think about what these women actually did. So they worked for the City of Dublin in a wide variety of jobs. Tabitha Platt received £8 for ringing the bells at 4 o'clock and 9 o'clock. Ruth Whitten worked as a keeper of the clocks, and she was paid £4 for winding the clocks, and she got more money if she cleaned them and repaired them. We see many examples of women acting as cleaners, but also as contractors. So, for example, Elizabeth Duff maintained the slips at Merchant and Wood Quay. Another was the ferry keeper. So we see them in a wide variety of jobs. I think probably the most intriguing, and certainly of greatest interest to the media, was the office of City Scavenger, which was held in the 1630s by Catherine Strong, a widow. Now, she was entitled to collect tolls or charge a fine in return, and I'm quoting here, for clearing great heaps of dung from the main thoroughfares and the market areas. Now, this is an age with only very basic water pipes, and we have those cess rolls I've just discovered recently, but there's no sewage system, and the disposal of human and animal waste generated by a population of 8,000 people living in close proximity, together with the removal of refuse, would have really been a considerable challenge. And as far as I can see, the only public toilets were long drops into the Liffey. And you can see again complaints about, I mentioned earlier, Elizabeth Moore, who lived off Cook Street. The lane behind her house became a dumping ground where local inhabitants, forgive the pun, cast, quote, their filth and excrements. So you can only begin to imagine the stench, especially on a hot summer's day, and little wonder that fevers and fluxes, presumably associated with diseases like dysentery, typhoid, typhus, were such killers. So, I was going to say we complain today, and people don't know they're living. Thanks to the profits made from muck, entrepreneurial Catherine also operated as a moneylender. She appeared as a creditor on the Dublin statute staple. Now, just if you're not familiar with the staple was a means of securing a loan or a debt in an era when there were no banks and no credit cards, and when actual coinage was in extremely short supply. So it's a very important way of securing a debt. And when we look closely at those records, we can see, in fact, there were 38 women like Catherine Steele who were appearing as creditors and as debtors. Again, widows predominate, but there are a lot of single women there, and I'm not entirely sure what's going on with that. We need to figure that one out. Of particular interest in terms of the relationship women had with money lending are the depositions, and recorded amongst the losses of many women, especially widows, were ready money and debts owed. So in the deposition, they'll record their losses, including their debts. And as I say, it provides us fascinating insight into how money lending operated. And it's because in the deposition, people would often list the person to whom they'd lent money, their address, sometimes their occupation. And you can see in this single image, it's a deposition by a Dublin widow called Ellen Lindsay of the money that she lent and when she lent it. Now, of course, the onset of war destroyed this ecosystem of borrowing and lending, and these webs of indebtedness where trust breaks down and the whole thing becomes just a mess because the Irish debtors refuse to pay or the insurgents actively destroy evidence of debt while the English debtors are unable to pay. So it's a really interesting story around money lending, but it's just one example, because what I'm finding is time and again women are proving to be extremely astute entrepreneurs who exercise remarkable agency. And we see women working in every aspect, for example, of the hospitality business, running inns and boarding houses as owners of taverns and ale houses, or operating sort of what we call drinking dens from their own homes. Interestingly, the women who worked in these boarding houses and the taverns provided depositions about overheard conversations that were had on the eve of the insurrection. So the rebellion breaks out in October 1641. The first people the commissioners go to try and figure out what's going on were the local women who were running the boarding houses and the inns, because they realised that they were the eyes and ears of the community, and they ran establishments where people met and gossiped and exchanged news and plotted over their pints of beer and ale. Now, of course, women were extremely involved in the production of both ale and beer. And remember, this was a trade that was not regulated. There was no guild. It wasn't even officially recognised, and until the 1630s wasn't taxed. Imagine a world where there's no tax on alcohol. But this was also an age when people drank on average. Now, I'm going to, just another quick test. Susan Flavin, my colleague at Trinity, has done remarkable work on this. How many pints of beer or ale did the average person drink in this period? A day, not a week, a day. Any guesses, please?
4 pints.
Yeah, now you're talking. Actually, the average was between 5 and 10. 15 was not uncommon. And Susan has done work on the alcohol content of these, and you're looking at, well, she thinks it's about 5% strength, which is the equivalent of 3 units of alcohol. Imagine, they were just drunk the whole time. I mean, it's and it's very interesting because contemporary observers, a man called Barnaby Rich, now Barnaby Rich is a very unsympathetic English observer, but he says, there is no merchandise so vendible, adding that beer is the very marrow of the Commonwealth in Dublin. The whole profit of the town stands upon alehouses and the selling of ale. Now, much of this brewing was small scale and took place in the home or the tavern. And just in case you think this is a sample, that should be with the doctors. Actually, Susan brewed a beer from a recipe at 1574, and it was on the basis of that she was able to estimate the alcohol content. It's a fabulous project, folks, called Food Cult, if anybody's interested. Now, this is again where Ireland is different from what's going on in England, because in England, men displace women as brewers, whereas in Ireland, women are very active as brewers, and by the later 17th century, Gilbert has suggested there were, in the city of Dublin, small area, you ready for this? There were nearly 1,200 ale houses and 91 public brew houses. Women would have been running at least 25% of them. I think the figure is higher, actually, but we hope we'll be able to work that out. But in addition, women are running proper full-scale breweries. Sometimes they do this independently, and other times in partnership with a man. Now, given the strength of early modern beer and the quantities consumed, drunkenness and disorder become associated with the alehouses, as of course did prostitution. So according to Barnaby Rich, again, not a sympathetic observer, he says, it is as rare a thing to find a house in Dublin without a tavern as to find a tavern without a strumpet. He continued, a man could have his pot of ale, his pipe of tobacco, and his pocky whore, and all for his 3 pence. There you go. Now, the city, of course, took exception to this, and they took particular exception to women selling, and especially single women, selling ale from their homes on the grounds that the apprentices, along with the students from Trinity, they were desperately concerned about the moral welfare of the Trinity students and that they might be led astray by, quote, evil-disposed women. The city pilloried them in the marketplace if they were caught, and sometimes banished them from the city unless they married an honest man. But what is very clear from the evidence is that the sex trade flourished. There's an anonymous poem from the 1670s which vividly relates the antics of Dublin prostitutes and their titled clients in a brothel that predates Mrs. Leeson's by well over 100 years. I'm going to spare you the raunchy verse, but suffice to say that the exploitation of Dublin, the exploitation in Dublin of women as sex workers has a very long history. Many more women were servants. I've already touched on this, but in the 1696 enumeration by John South, female servants, presumably unmarried, accounted for 25% of the adult female population. And you can see them here in red. So the blue, strong blue is adult females, and then the children, the girls, are in light blue, and the servants in red. Now, some of those servants would have been born in Dublin, but others would have moved from rural areas in search of employment. We see fleeting references to them in the burial records for St John's Parish in the 1641 depositions, where a servant might testify in the absence of her mistress or corroborate a story. But of course, as is so much the case with society in this period, there's a hierarchy amongst servants. And very occasionally, for example, a lady's maid might accumulate some personal wealth which she left in her will. And Brona has found at least one, if not more, very interesting wills of basically ladies' maids who lived in Dublin. Other women worked in public spaces. Women sold fruit, apples, oranges, lemons, along with nuts, salt, eggs, chickens, fish, and other produce in the street and in the marketplace. Many travelled into the city and would have paid a toll, a charge for the privilege of doing so. But others, of course, sold their wares illicitly, including tobacco and sneezing salt, which is, of course, snuff. And this irritated the city fathers enormously. The councillors weren't happy and gave out stink about it. Care for the poor fell to the city. They appointed beadles, and they were instructed, and I quote here, to banish the beggars and keep away the swine. That's what they were actually instructed to do. In terms of providing for their own, you have the deserving poor of Dublin, and they instructed a woman called Margaret Murphy in 1604 to run a poorhouse, but to do so outside the walls, to keep the poor out of the city. In the later 1660s, there was a push to establish a hospital for the poor and for orphans, and thereby reduce the number of homeless street beggars. It was all about taking the beggars off the street. And so much of this is so resonant with so much that we see today. The city made particular provision, pensions, relief from debts, favourable leases to property for the widows of freemen. So that was one of the advantages of being a citizen. The city would take care of your widow. And there was a remarkable philanthropist, a woman called Anne St. Lawrence. She was the widow of Lord Hoath, and she actually left an endowment to support 6 poor widows, such as go to church. So very clear about it. Doesn't say which one, but as long as they go. And it's interesting when you look at the assembly rolls to see how these women are vying to be one of the 6 widows. So when one dies, one immediately takes her place. Individual parishes, of course, also contribute to caring for the poor. And when we look at the vestry records for St. John's Parish, you can see an increase in the number who are begging. And this is linked to the harvest crises and the food shortages of the 1630s. My colleague Frances Ludlow has a fabulous project looking at the relationship between environmental disasters and a social and political movement of peoples. But what it does is it means that the city is then totally ill-equipped to deal with the human misery unleashed by the outbreak of war in October 1641. And this brings me to my final question, and I promise I am coming to the end, Librarian. We'll let everybody get to their drink in a moment, but I do want to say, I hope it's ale. No. So when it comes to the war, basically Dublin is a walled city, and the insurgents never actually managed to breach the walls of the city and capture the city, but instead they raid the suburbs. And we see this from the depositions. There's one dating from November 1641 by Tabitha Eccles, who relates how the insurgents attacked her home and farm at Ballyboch, just, of course, the north inner city. Elizabeth, what we see as the north inner city, which was a suburb. Another suburb was St. Michan's. The parish of St. Michan's was attacked. But the one that resonates particularly with me was St. Kevin's Church, which is just off Camden Street. There's a deposition describing how the insurgents came within a musket shot of the trenches near St. Kevin's Church, where they stole cattle, bulls, household goods. They also destroy houses, burn orchards, and we have a very sort of, I think, poignant account from a widow named Grace Venner. This is in May 1646. She lives, and I'm quoting, near the College of Dublin and St. Patrick's Well. so just up the road. And she explains how a soldier, quote, being an Irishman, had robbed her of cash, clothing, linen, and household stuff. He also assaulted her, injuring her right arm so that she was, quote, disabled to get her living, and being very aged is in danger to perish by want. So widow Venner, like so many others, depended for her survival on charity. But she also tells us how much she lost. And this is, I want to make this point, that we can learn so much about material culture from the depositions. Now, obviously, Grace Venner was a very poor woman, and the depositions record losses of between £9, which was widow Venner, and then £6,766 by a woman called Margaret Watson, whose husband Philip had been a former mayor of Dublin. And just to give you a little bit of context, £1,000 in 1640 would be the equivalent of £188,000 in 2017. So it just shows you that actually even £9 was something. And £1,000 would have bought you 185 cows or paid a skilled man for nearly just over 14,000 days. So in terms of thinking about the material culture, the depositions have an awful lot more to tell us, and the project we hope will uncover that. I want to say, though, a little bit more about the city, because, of course, the city was put on high alert. Defence became a priority, and basically the suburbs around the city were destroyed, on the one hand by the insurgents, but on the other by the city itself, because they wanted to deny quarter to the insurgents. The medieval walls were completely revamped, and they may not look very fancy, but we got these new fancy Tres Italienne artillery fortifications that were built. This is here from the Downs survey. Women were very active in the construction of fortifications, and in 1646, women from the age of 15, and irrespective of social status, that's a very important point, were required to help to secure the city. They usually carried baskets of earth to the fortifications, but they also paid a lot of money in cess or tax for the support of the garrison of soldiers and to feed the soldiers. Those tax records have survived. So again, we're very keen to work with those. Many of the women whose soldiers served, signed up when the war broke out, they died, leaving them with dependent children, an elderly parent, some kind of dependent family member. And I think you can't overstate the caring responsibilities that women had to undertake during this period. Now, at one level, women might have exaggerated their helplessness because they want to win support. However, it shouldn't diminish what was really an extraordinarily grim and bitter moment. And not just for the women who lived in Dublin, but for the refugees who came into the city. And I do want to say a few words about these refugees and just share with you just a single example, and there are hundreds. But it's of a woman who was 40 years old. She was called Mary Bennington, and she and her husband William and their 4 small children finally reached Dublin in 1642 after a traumatic journey from County Fermanagh. Remember, this is the coldest winter on record. You had snow on the ground from October. Since arriving in the city, Mary's husband and 2 children had died, and 2 other children were, quote, very sick and not likely to live by means of the cold and the hunger they did undergo. So they're exceptionally vulnerable. And these women and their sick and starving offspring, of course, were dependent on the city for support, but the city was utterly overwhelmed. And I'm not going to go into the detail here, but that's that first spike. It shows you the death toll in a single parish in 1642. I'll come back to the other spike in a moment. But people, these refugees were pouring into the city. They were apparently dying at the rate of 30 a day. I know that the records for St John's Parish record in the year 1642 181 deaths. So you're just seeing this massive spike. And the church warden accounts record sums allocated, quote, for the burying the poor who were found dead in the streets and for caring for the children left on the parish. So some widows wanted to work, but those who couldn't work were encouraged to go back to their home parishes. These were their home parishes in England and Scotland. So as soon as they came to Dublin, the city did everything possible to move them back to England because it didn't want to take responsibility for them. It was bankrupt. And this comes across so strongly in the depositions. So I just want to say a little bit about the violence experienced by women during this period. So we only have 12 women who are refugees, but the stories that they bring to Dublin, and there would have been hundreds of others in the city who don't depose, are very personal narratives of what they had experienced during the rebellion, including assault, imprisonment, the stripping of clothes, hostage taking, sexual violence, and the murder of loved ones, often at the hands of men and women they would have known. And okay, this happened in the counties where they had lived, but they bring these stories to the city and they start to tell each other. See that big question mark with rape? I'll come back to that in a moment. I'm going to give you a single example because we don't have time for any more. It's basically the story of Susanna Stockdale, who deposes in 1643. Now, she deposes when she was married to a Dublin gentleman, but 2 years earlier, she'd been married to another man called Noah Vaughan, who was a wealthy farmer from County Offaly. And she tells her story how she and her husband sought refuge at Leap Castle. Of course, the most haunted castle in Ireland, isn't it? Maybe this is part of the story. And I actually I'll let you read the deposition. I don't need to read it to you. But you can get a very clear sense of the testimony that she, in her testimony, how she really vividly articulates the shame, the humiliation as she experienced, being stripped, tied up, held prisoner, and treated as an animal. Now, as I say, Susanna's experiences were absolutely typical of so many. And I would just like to use this deposition to explore two things. One is, what does this tell us about sexual violence against women? And the other is, what does it tell us about communal relations and the relations between communities? So all of the Dublin refugees report being stripped, and most of them were stripped naked. And now the insurgents would have been looking for money, jewels, other valuables that was hidden in clothing, might have been their hair, their shoes. But of course, stripping is about much more than finding money or the economic value of clothing. The high incidence of stripping, which of course is a form of sexual assault in itself, makes the virtual absence of reported rape all the more striking. And I don't have time to go into it here, but I would be arguing that in 1640s Ireland, the shame and social stigma attached to rape and the circumstances in which the deponents were giving their witness testimony. They were doing it in a public place and they were giving it to Church of Ireland clergymen. All of this probably stopped a lot more cases being reported. So we have to look at phrases like so violently and in most disgraceful manner, or stripped stark naked, because I think they're hugely suggestive of sexual violence. And this is, again, something that we're working on in this project. This is an image from the Tears of Ireland, but I work very closely with an amazing artist called Rita Duffy. I'm sure many of you know her. And this is one of her responses to reading the depositions. And you can see the timelessness of so much of this. In terms of communal relations, I think here the depositions record dialogue, conversations between people. There's a particularly interesting one between Mrs. Kennedy and Mrs. Nagel. Now, Mrs. Kennedy is a refugee who is fleeing. This is in Longford. And Mrs. Nagel, her husband is a merchant in Longford. So these two women would have known each other. Anyway, Mrs. Kennedy is pregnant, she's feeling faint, and she asked Mrs. Nagel if she would sell her, quote, some aquavit. She refused, saying she would pour her aquavit on the dunghill before any English dog should have any of it. Now, this is so interesting because historically, English chroniclers described the Irish as dogs, as animals, as being subhuman. So what we're seeing here is Mrs. Nagel exercising agency as she verbally abused a woman whom she knew and whose presence she clearly resented. And I think there's a lot more that we can do and will do with this. Naomi McCarthy is also doing fabulous work on this. The woman who reports the exchange is Mary Martin, and Mary Martin, we know, comes to Dublin with Mrs. Kennedy. She works as her servant, and then she marries Jerry. And Jerry was a local tailor, and so she makes Cook Street, Dublin, her home. So again, you're able to follow all of these peoples and their life stories over time. And what we can see is the war transformed the lives of individuals, but it also transformed the life of the city because it was overwhelmed with refugees. It struggled to defend itself and remain on a war footing for a decade. We see half of the city's homes destroyed, and what remained was in very poor repair. Skilled labour was in short supply. Water courses were blocked. Refuse piled high in the streets. Prices soared. Profiteering flourished. And then there was a major outbreak of plague in June and July 1650, and that brought Dublin to its knees. And that brings us to that second spike. And you can see so clearly that the numbers of deaths in June and July 1650 almost equal the entirety of 1642. And it's not just that individuals were dying of the plague, entire families were being wiped out. And on this occasion, women were harder hit with more dying than men. And I think at dark moments like this, when we see women literally bear the brunt of death, it's critical to remember that they did wear war quite literally on their backs. And now, of course, depending on their social and marital status and where they lived, their experiences of the conflict varied enormously. But their ability to recover from that trauma is something that we're really just beginning to explore. But they certainly bore witness to it. But survive they did. And women, of course, go on to play a critical role in the recovery of the city post-1660 and contribute to the rise of Dublin as that sort of great second city of empire. And of course, we've got this wonderful quote in 1686 when Dublin is placed as one of the top 12 European cities. Sir William Petty compared it favourably to Paris, London, Amsterdam, Venice and Rome. So Petty, of course, never acknowledged the contribution of women, neither did any of his contemporaries, but without a shadow of a doubt, ordinary women played their part. They weren't absent from the history of early modern Dublin, as I hope to have suggested here. They have been hiding in plain sight in records that we're very familiar with. And I suppose it's our hope that over the course of the next 4 years, we'll not only make the women of Dublin visible, but we will also help make the voices heard of women living across the island. So thank you very much indeed for your attention. Thank you. Sorry.
Well, Jane, Lorraine, I think I speak for everybody here when I say I'm absolutely blown away by the information that you've provided tonight. Thank you so much. A couple of things to note. First of all, I think what stood out there was, although it's a very different city that we live in now, there are some correlations between then and now, especially, for example, with the treatment of the poor and of refugees. Secondly, that what is wonderful about the statistical analysis is that people like us here in the room tonight and everyone at home can understand more about the tone and the attitude of the city, what it was like as a whole to live in Dublin, and the environment that everybody was living in, instead of just seeing pockets of information here and there. So absolutely fascinating work. And also to say that I don't think I'll complain anymore about the workload of the city archivist in comparison to the city scavenger, Catherine Strong, much worse setup there. So I'm very, very grateful to be doing my work. So as I said, thank you so much for that. It was absolutely wonderful. Many of you here will already know that Dublin City Library and Archive, we have hundreds of metres, if not kilometres, of unique material relating to the development of the city, and it dates back as far as the 12th century. All of the work that goes into revealing and analysing these records is always ongoing, never over, and as Jane mentioned throughout the talk, the Virtual Records Treasury of Ireland is central to that. And I know Professor Declan O'Sullivan is here tonight, and others on the team. We're so glad that you're here. But also to say that we're so glad that Dublin City Library and Archive and all the archive services across local government will be working with the VRTI over the next couple of years in the next phase of their work. The phase of work that's started in 2023 is the Deep History and Deepening Collaborations Research Programme. And throughout that, we'll be building on earlier investigations the team have been doing to identify a variety of records, for example, the grand jury records, which work was done on before in the Beyond 2022 project, but also the records of parishes, townships and poor law union, other medieval documents and later documents, to begin to reconstruct our understanding of the period. So we're so excited about doing that work with the VRTI and the others on that team. I'll just say a few thank yous, and then we can have questions and discussions next door in the Dublin room, if that's okay. Everybody can have some refreshments and speak at ease. So I want to say thank you to Jamie and Darlith from Up and Away Media tonight for doing all of the live streaming and the recording of the event. Also to Damien here who's taking photographs. To Love and Catering, you're going to enjoy their fair next door, and it's really great. We usually get Love and Catering, and we're really delighted that they're here. And finally to the DCLA team of archivists and librarians and actually miracle workers that are here tonight. I want to especially thank Tara Doyle for being coordinator of the evening and for managing the publication of Dr Kennedy's lecture from last year. It's a beautiful publication, and we're really proud to have worked on that. And also to Linda Hickey, Mairead Walsh and Jessica McCarry for doing such a fantastic job. I'm really grateful. So I think without further ado, I'll ask you all to join us next door. Thank you so much. Slán go fóill.